Wherever you are, welcome back to my studio in Zhongshan. And I was asked a question a while ago, and I'm afraid I didn't record who asked it, but his name was Terry. And if you see this, Terry, I apologize for not recording your handle like I usually do when I respond to a question. I was traveling, it was some time ago, and I thought it was well worth coming back to. So I recorded my answer, but forgot to record the person who sent it. The question was, how come people like Kevin Rudd, who is highly influential, experienced, and well-educated on China, is always so wrong about what China will do? Now, for anyone who doesn't know who Kevin Rudd is, he's a former Prime Minister of Australia. I actually respected, admired him even, and once voted for him as he was in Brisbane, where I lived at the time that he entered Parliament. A long time ago, he worked in China as a diplomat. He speaks Mandarin very well. He has many Chinese connections and is currently the Australian ambassador to the United States of America. So he is very influential. And we should be able to expect that people such as him would get things right. But he often talks about threats from China, China's coercion, other aspects of China in a negative way. He's written a book on how Xi Jinping thinks. And although I haven't read the book, I've seen a couple of his interviews, and I couldn't disagree more with what I've seen him say. I live in China, I've worked many years here, I travel often and I travel widely, but I hold very different opinions to this expert. I'm not a psychologist, but I do have qualifications in psychology. I also have qualifications in cross-cultural change management, and I have more experience of living in China than Kevin Rudd ever had. I'm not advised by public service advisors. I don't rely on think tanks to form my opinions. I don't pay for advice on China from people who live, work, and are educated outside of China. I ask people in China, Chinese people, what they think. I'm not connected to any ambassador or anyone else who works in the diplomatic arena, nor am I living in an expat bubble in a rich suburb of Shanghai, Shenzhen, or Beijing. I live in a small apartment in a tiny, by Chinese standard, city. And when I travel, I usually do so by train or bike. When I travel by train, I often choose the slow trains, and this is where we meet ordinary Chinese people. This is where we talk with people. The high-speed trains are great, I love them, but they're very much like airplanes. We get on, we sit down, and we kind of switch off our external communication antenna. We sit quietly for the few hours that it takes us to whiz across China. So with that background, that experience, and those qualifications, I have opinions that might be worth listening to. However, in government in Australia, the USA, the UK, and Europe, not one person will bother to ask me because they'll say, my experience is biased. I like China too much. And it's true, I do. However, I'd argue vehemently that bias can be both negative and positive. My positive bias should, if we want world peace, if we want global trade, and if we want what the Chinese like to call harmony in society, we should be giving greater consideration to that positive bias. Negative bias is usually formed by negative experiences. And I'm willing to bet people like Kevin Rudd, who lived in China for many years, had none or very few negative experiences here. It's a wonderful place to live. The people he met here would have been welcoming and friendly. So how is it that he's formed these negative impressions of China over the years? It's because of who taught us. Rudd was a diplomat. His education was through other diplomats. He's taught by experts who are usually foreigners, and by that I mean they aren't Chinese. When they are taught by Chinese people, the people who teach them have to go through vetting and approval processes to ensure that they have the right attitude. They're often Western educated too. They have perceptions given to them, and they have perceptions learned from experiences, which are very different to those experiences of the families that I chat with on the slow trains. Kevin Rudd would have lived in a compound with other diplomats. He might even have been advised not to fraternize with the locals. He might have felt oppressed. He might have felt watched, under suspicion, as a member of a foreign diplomatic corps, but he would only have been protected, not oppressed. That's how China works. They protect and care for people. But for us foreigners, we sometimes feel that we're under surveillance, rather than we're being protected. It's different culture. I was taught almost everything I know about China by ordinary people who live in China. They love China and they understand it deeply. Most of them acknowledge the great contributions of people like Mao and Deng without the biases instilled in us by reading Western written analyses of things like the Cultural Revolution or works of fiction written by people who never met those men. I learned from real experts, people who would never claim expertise but have lived experiences that have shaped who they are and where they're going. Diplomats and politicians learn from people who might claim expertise but have been taught, not experienced. Not always correctly taught either, but then they pass that information on to other diplomats and other politicians, again, not always correctly and always with their own biases. It's very hard when your teacher teaches you that Chinese people will think or act in one way to realize that this is how we would think and act, not how people born into a different culture with different backgrounds, different hierarchies, and with different experiences would act. And this is where behavioral psychology is so important. We do things because they're expected of us in our society. Different societies will do things differently. And this is true the world over. It's often the cause of misunderstandings. It even leads to wars. John Lander, a former diplomat, the only one I know alive today. Dennis Argal, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, was another. They deeply understand and understood China. They were the first Australian diplomats to come to China. Look online for interviews with John and for Dennis's written work. He was prolific. When these people worked in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade or the Diplomatic Corps, Australia was headed in a very different direction. Australia opened relations with China before the USA did. Gough Whitlam, one of Australia's most popular prime ministers, came to China before Kissinger and Nixon did. He was well advised, he was knowledgeable, and he was open to long-term, mutually beneficial relations with China, which he started the moment he was elected into office by recognizing China, the PRC of China. Whitlam, once elected, pulled out of Vietnam. That's something the Americans didn't like at all. He threatened to curtail US influence in Australia, and he wanted to close down one of the CIA's most important sites outside of the US, Pine Gap, in the Northern Territory. This is not a conspiracy to say that he was removed from office in a combined action by the CIA and the British monarchy. It's actually a documented fact. I never got to interview Dennis Argal, but he was something of a mentor to me. We had lots of emails. I was setting out to speak about China in the public arena. He discovered my online writing. He connected with me. He introduced me to some important people, such as John Menadue of Pearls and Irritations, as well as John Lander himself. And his writing is on a par with Paul Keating, another former Australian Prime Minister who knew and still asserts that Australia needed to work with, not against China. Dennis Argal, John Lander, Paul Keating, John Menadue, they all understand China because they are the people who advised from China. If you look at Keating's generation and the generation of politicians before him, you'll see a very different perception in Australia on the same China. It isn't China which has changed, the perception of China. And the perception is now being shaped by US funding into consultancies, academia, and think tanks, providing misunderstood intelligence guided by biases and by misinterpretation of facts by people who have an instilled bias. Kevin Rudd is no exception. Albanese, the current Prime Minister of Australia, is not like this. We can't expect him to know anything at all about China. It's not his fault that he's being badly advised. His defense minister, Christopher Marles, is completely in the thrall of US intelligence. His foreign affairs minister, Penny Wong, has no idea that China could and actually should be Australia's friend because the intelligence community is telling her differently. Now, she would argue it's not the US intelligence telling her this, it's the Australian intelligence. Where are they getting it from? The sources are the same biased, ill-informed, and mostly Washington-funded sources. It's hardly a surprise that Kevin Rudd and I have differences of opinions. All opinions are formed by experiences. His are very different to mine. And although many would say, I don't have access to the higher levels of Chinese governance, nor do I have access to the same intelligence reports as he has, therefore I'm not getting the full picture from the ground. And I'd argue that if I were to have access to the same intelligence reports, I'd spend my life refuting and correcting them, as I know they'd be wrong. None of these intelligence sources have access into China's high level of governance. The only people who know what's going on in the Politburo of China are the Politburo of China and the people that they tell when they come out of their meetings. And this isn't like the White House. If the president farts, they make a press announcement. Or when they make some kind of secret decision, they feed it to the media. Beijing isn't a sieve like this. No one knows what goes on there except people authorized to know, which is why when I want to know what's happening in China, I ask Chinese people. I read Chinese media. I look for Chinese government information sites, and I understand what China is thinking, what they're planning, and how they hope to achieve their goals. When Washington, Canberra, or Whitehall want to know what's going on in China, they pay people in Washington, Canberra, or Whitehall to make up reports to fit a strategy that they'd like to employ. And that's really why highly influential, well-educated, and intelligent people keep getting China wrong. As to why fools like Gordon Chang and Adrian Zenz get things wrong, that's another video I'll make. And there are enough people who want to watch something like that. So please let me know in the comments. And as usual, don't forget to like, share, and of course, widely subscribe to my channel for more of my slightly more accurate reports on China than you'll get through ASPI and the like. Thanks once again for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.